Three truths decide sea wars. Who sees first, who arrives first, who learns fastest. Early on, U-boats owned all three. Then the Allies changed the questions. HFDF for bearings, centimetric radar to erase Knight's Ultra for plans not yet executed. One improvement is an edge. 10 in a row is inevitability. Watch how inevitability feels inside a pressure hull. Routine battery charges become ambushes. Routine reports become beacons. Routine evasion becomes a countdown. By the winter of 1942-43, that countdown had hardened into habit for Germany's U-boat crews. Survival was brief. Mistakes were permanent, and home meant a shrinking circle on a hostile map. The U-boat war was lost because Allied sensors, intelligence, and air power fused into a kill web that arithmetic alone favored. Once it closed, 9 out of 10 boats would not return. Yet it had not started that way. In 1939-41, Admiral Karl Dönitz's Rudel tactic, wolfpack attacks at night on the surface, ripped through thin escort screens while early sonar, known as Aztec, searched in vain for targets that rode the waves. Names like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke were printed on triumphs measured in tonnage sunk, not boats lost. The Atlantic felt like a predator's sea, but predation invites countermeasure. Each radio contact report that summoned a pack also betrayed a bearing. Each refueling rendezvous left a fingerprint on the air. High-frequency direction finding, HF, DF, or HUFDUF, began dragging invisible lines across weather maps. Centimetric radar lit low silhouettes once thought invisible. The Leigh Lights snapped midnight into noon. Escort carriers ferried patrols into the mid-ocean air gap. Hedgehog mortars drove contact-only warheads precisely into evasive tracks. Overhead, consolidated B-24 Liberators ranged far beyond coastal horizons, and short Sunderlands stitched patrol lines where no aircraft had loitered before. At Bletchley Park, ultra decrypts turned secrecy into schedule, moving convoys like chess pieces out of harm's prearranged way. Inside the pressure hulls, the war translated into touch and taste, oil-slicked flooring, clammy condensation dripping from frames, air that soured as partial pressure climbed and men counted their breath. A dive was sound before sight, the slap of charges, the ping of active sonar, the creak of frames as depth rose toward the edge of metallurgical certainty. Even success carried its cost. Surfacing to charge batteries risked a radar return. Sprinting on diesels produced a wake that aircraft could read like a signature. Transmitting a sighting report was a flare in the ether for HFDF arrays to triangulate. The ocean was still vast, but the spaces that were safe were fewer each week. The war at sea turned stepwise. First, lone escorts learning to listen, then screens and support groups able to detach and hunt, then carriers, aircraft, centimetric sets, plotting rooms, and decrypt teams replacing luck with method. By late 1942, the Atlantic was no longer merely water. It was a mapped problem with bearings, frequencies, and probabilities. The question ahead is not how the U-boats hunted. It is how the ocean learned to hunt them back, and why the men inside those steel coffins discovered that courage could not outswim math. In 1940-41, the happy time felt like vindication, a season when the geometry of war favored the hunter. U-boats roamed the North Atlantic in lean arcs, surfacing to sprint into convoys where moonlit lanes framed columns of slow freighters. Torpedoes traced white scars under the skin of the sea. Explosions rolled along the horizon, and escort screens gaped with holes familiar to anyone who had counted too few destroyers against too many miles. The Type 7, short-legged but lethal, did most of the killing. The longer-range Type 9 ranged into distant approaches. Britain's Royal Navy, overextended and rebuilding, could not be everywhere. Aztec could hear targets below, yet at night a surfaced U-boat was a low charcoal streak, almost impossible to pick out beyond a short visual range. Dönitz's calculus seemed ironclad. Sink merchant tonnage faster than the Allies could build it. Starve an island economy. Compel negotiation. Enigma traffic looked unbreakable. Centralized control and radio brevity let packs mass at decisive points, concentrating torpedoes where it mattered most. Crews were young and claustrophobically fearless. The culture of the arm embraced risk as tempo. Approach on the surface where speed and maneuver belonged to the attacker, then dive to evade the angry chaos that followed. The psychology cut one way. Hunters chose time and place. They owned surprise, and surprise is a multiplier. Even the sea's weather worked like a mask, blotting search patterns, bending sound, and hiding wakes in whitecaps. Each victory reinforced habit. Each habit drew a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, become levers. What began as separate anecdotes of loss for the Allies hardened into a data set. Every sighting report carried a direction for HFDF to scrape from the ether. Every rendezvous with a supply milch cow was a predictable geometry of time and distance. In the Western approaches, tracking rooms learned to assemble shreds into pictures, dots into lines, lines into intent. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the battlefield broadened with temptation. Early 1942 off the American coast, often called the Second Happy Time, offered thinly protected shipping and dark coastal skylines. But even there, the industrial and scientific response had begun. Convoy discipline would harden, coastal blackouts would dim, shipyards would accelerate, aircraft would stretch their reach. The razor turned not with a single invention, but with a system. The crews did not feel it yet. The numbers still looked like advantage. The sea still felt large when a periscope broke its surface and found a scattered convoy. Yet beneath the surface of statistics, an Allied network was forming that would make large into a trap and turn distance into delay. The habits that yielded kills were also the breadcrumbs that would lead hunters to the hunters. The turning of the war sounded like static and looked like searchlight. Static, that was HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, triangulating brief U-boat transmissions into bearings that plotting rooms could draw in pencil and confidence. Searchlight, that was the Leigh Light, a belly-mounted lamp on patrol aircraft that burst on like a stolen sunrise, freezing a surfaced U-boat in a cone of brightness long enough for depth charges to fall true. What technology could not see in 1941, centimetric radar at 10-centimeter wavelengths learned to detect by 1942-43. Those shorter wavelengths, once laboratory curiosities, rode into battle on consolidated B-24 Liberators and short Sunderlands, turning a low silhouette into a bright, trackable return and even catching the tiny periscope feather at distance. Air power stitched shut the mid-Atlantic air gap that had sheltered boats during battery charging nights. Escort carriers brought fighters and bombers to convoys. Long-range patrols orbited distress calls instead of chasing rumors. On the waterline, the Hedgehog mortar, forward-throwing, contact-fused, changed psychology. Depth charges had taught boats to wait for the blossom and count, to read the misses. Hedgehog offered no warning bloom, only a quiet pattern followed sometimes by a single final crack. Sonar sharpened by training and analysis could translate the nervous language of a boat under stress. A sudden change in revolutions, a knuckle of disturbed water, the pause before a desperate turn. Where escorts had once been guardians, support groups became pursuers, detaching to hunt for hours or days while convoys moved on. Countermeasures emerged, but lagged the curve. The METOX radar detector warned of older Allied sets but announced itself to new ones, and forced frequency shifts that erased its utility. U-boats adopted bolder evasion patterns and deeper dives, stretching hulls toward crush margins and betting on thermoclines to bend sound. Meanwhile, Allied laboratories and frontline debriefs tightened loops of improvement. Each sunk boat taught settings. Each captured device taught doctrine. Each engagement became a lesson filed, copied, and issued. The sea is large, but every sensor made it smaller. Every doctrine that combined air, ship, and plotting made it coherent. The result was cumulative rather than spectacular, felt by crews as coincidence. An aircraft appeared sooner than expected. A destroyer group held contact longer than seemed possible. A convoy that should have been where the pack waited was simply not there. That repetition of unlikely outcomes shifted the emotional weather below decks. Radioing risked bearings. Surfacing risked radar. Lingering risked the silent geometry of a support group's box. As instruments that did not sleep filled the sky in the plotting rooms, the U-boat's classic edge, nocturnal surprise on the surface, began to evaporate. The next test would come not in theory but in blood. in a single month when arithmetic declared itself in sinking hulls and thinning ranks. That month would be called Black May. May 1943 opened with the feel of a tide turning and closed with a ledger of loss that crews would remember as Schwarzer Mai, Black May. The convoy battle that made the point was ONS 5, westbound from the British Isles to North America, slow and vulnerable, the kind of target a wolf pack was created to ruin. On paper, it invited attack. In practice, it became a demonstration of a new Allied method. Guided by HFDF cuts from brief U-boat transmissions, reinforced by centimetric radar sweeps and persistent air cover from very long-range B-24 Liberators, support groups detached from convoy screens to hold and hand off contacts. They rotated pressure, analyzed sonar returns in real time, and tailored depth charge settings to conditions. Hedgehog patterns punished attempted end-around maneuvers. Merchant losses occurred, but the balance reversed. More U-boats were destroyed or damaged than ships saved were sunk, and the psychological bill came due. Black May's numbers were stark. U-boat losses spiked to a rate the training pipeline could not sustain. Boats that survived reported attacks stacked atop attacks. The margin for error, once broad, narrowed to a knife's width. Dönitz, reading signals and reports, pulled many units from North Atlantic convoy lanes because continued operations promised annihilation without strategic reward. Shipbuilding in Allied yards now outpaced sinkings by such a margin that tonnage arithmetic, his original razor, cut against him. The hunter-killer groups were no longer simply protective. They were predatory, ranging ahead and behind convoys to attrit packs before they could mass. What changed emotionally for the men below was the sense that the ocean itself had turned. Depth felt shallower, air tasted thinner. The cycle of attack and evasion turned from a professional ritual into a coin toss played too many times. Even tactical innovations, bold decoys, deeper runs, violent course changes, could not erase the strategic truth that the enemy understood their methods almost as well as they did. Each survivor carried back specifics that training commands codified. The Allies learned from every kill. The U-boat arm paid for every lesson twice, once in a sinking, again in a manual. Black May did not end the campaign. It ended the idea of winning it. From that point, U-boat operations bore the marks of a force in strategic withdrawal, seeking relevance in narrower seas and specialized ambushes. The next phase would push the fight inside the hulls themselves, from the arithmetic of loss to the lived reality of life at crushed depth, where the war was measured not in miles or months but in hours without clean air, and in the creak of frames that hinted at limits men could feel with their fingertips. Stale air, diesel in the throat, fungus on bulkheads, and a film of oil on everything. Life aboard a U-boat was a slow negotiation with discomfort that, by 1943, leaned toward despair. Steel coffin was not metaphor. It was a daily register of senses. Crews hot-bunked in shifts, sharing narrow racks whose blankets never fully dried. Condensation collected on frames and dripped in a steady rhythm onto tables and faces. Food spoiled slowly and then all at once. Potatoes sprouted in the bilge. Tins rusted into their labels. The head could be locked for hours at depth, a logistical fact that needed no further description. Air grew heavy as partial pressure climbed, metallic and damp, tinged with battery acid and the salt of human endurance. Every dive invited a catechism learned by repetition. Count the seconds after a destroyer turned. Brace for the slap of depth charges, feel the hull sing. A boat could ride out a pattern by luck, by seamanship, or by both. Yet each evasion narrowed future choices. Deeper dives approached the limits of metallurgy. Rapid changes in depth risked structural fatigue. Bold decoys, chemical bubbles to spoof sonar, bought moments that evaporated. New electronics promised rescue and delivered compromise. Naxos receivers could sniff some Allied radar emissions, but not all, and arrived in a battle space where frequencies shifted faster than countermeasures matured. The snorkel, fielded widely in 1944, turned boats into true submarines, able to run diesels at periscope depth and remain longer below, but it fouled air with exhaust, reduced speed, and exposed a small yet detectable target whose wake and mast radar signature aircraft learned to read. Even the arm's sharp tools brought counter-tools. The T-5 Zaunkönig acoustic homing torpedo menaced escorts by listening for propeller noise. Within months, escorts towed noisemakers, adjusted speed profiles, and disciplined maneuvers to seduce or confuse the seeker. Fatigue, once merely an operational tax, became a strategic killer. Veteran crews were rotated or lost. Replacements were younger, less seasoned, and sent into a sea that had become an experienced enemy. Training boats and coastal transits, once safe, became targets as Allied air power and patrol craft pressed the fight to the Bay of Biscay and beyond. Below the surface, men learned the sound of patterns and the taste of fear, the way oxygen feels rationed and how silence amplifies imagination. Above them, the Allies learned to convert those human responses into kill chains. When a boat slowed to listen, an aircraft widened its circle. When a boat sprinted, plots predicted its next move. When a distress buoy appeared, a box of steel and patience closed. Orders still came, missions still sailed, bravery still counted. But bravery is a force multiplier only when the curve of probability has not bent. They trusted Enigma. The Allies read it often enough to matter. In early 1942, the German Navy shifted key Atlantic traffic to a four-rotor Enigma machine, complicating the work at Bletchley Park. Complexity delayed, but did not defeat cryptanalysis. Captures of codebooks and rotors from boarded weather trawlers and damaged U-boats handed cryptanalysts the essential starting points. What followed was not magic, but method. Electromechanical bombs to test settings at scale, mathematicians to prune impossibilities, linguists to recognize operational idiom. The output, a stream known as ultra, was never perfect, rarely timely in the tactical sense, yet decisive in turning probability into planning. Convoys were quietly routed around packs. Tankers skipped refueling rendezvous that had once felt safe. Hunter-killer groups appeared where U-boats meant to meet, breaking up concentrations before attacks could be staged. Meanwhile, radio discipline, the lifeblood of Dönitz's centralized control, was itself an exploitable signal. Each brief contact report to headquarters was a thread for HFDF to pluck from the sky and triangulate. Bearings produced search boxes produced sightings. Sightings forced evasive transmissions that produced more bearings. The synergy mattered more than any single piece. Decryption gave context to bearings. Bearings sent patrols. Patrols forced transmissions. Transmissions fed decryption. In the plotting rooms, this became choreography. At sea, it felt like coincidence repeated until coincidence looked like design. A boat surfaced to send a routine weather report, and an aircraft arrived. A refueling meeting was delayed, and a destroyer group appeared where fuel should have been. A wolf pack assembled on one side of an anticipated route and found only empty ocean. Intelligence did not sink boats by itself. It made every other Allied tool on time and in the right place. When centimetric radar met a convoy routed by ultra, the result was fewer opportunities for surprise. When a Hedgehog-equipped escort met a boat whose general position, HF-DF, had narrowed, the likelihood of contact became consequence. Time, once the U-boat's ally in choosing the moment of attack, betrayed it. By late 1943, the arm was outsensed and outguessed, fighting an opponent whose best weapon was an invisible clock and a network of rooms that smelled of cigarette smoke and hot wiring. That leaves only technology's last promises, the new hulls and higher submerged speeds that on paper could reset the contest. By 1944-45, survival meant adaptation or disappearance, and adaptation arrived with compromises baked in. The snorkel let U-boats run diesels at periscope depth, stretching submerged endurance and reducing the nightly exposure that radar aircraft had exploited. But the price was speed, air quality, and visibility. Exhaust fouled the boat. Crew headaches multiplied. The mast's small signature and the feather of its head became targets for ever more sensitive radar sets. The revolutionary type Wing Electroboot promised the reset that doctrine craved. Higher sustained submerged speed, greater battery capacity, rapid torpedo reloads, hydrodynamic lines optimized for underwater performance rather than surface sprinting. On a test sheet, it was the future. In war's final calendar, it was a rumor with too few hulls finished, too few crews trained, too little time to operationalize. The strategic environment made even innovation feel like retreat. Coastal command and escort carriers blanketed the Bay of Biscay. Destroyer escorts and frigates patrolled approaches in layered screens. Mines lay thick across routes to massive concrete pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, and Bordeaux. The pens themselves, architectural feats of reinforced concrete, shrugged off bombs but could not restore sea control. Transits became gauntlets where aircraft pounced on radar blips and wakes, and where support groups camped on likely lines of advance. Fuel ran short, spare parts grew scarce, and maintenance windows shrank under pressure. The young replaced the experienced, and the sea took its tax on inexperience with the same regularity it had once offered opportunity. Sharp tools still drew blood. The T-5 acoustic torpedo forced escorts to change tactics, and late-war ambushes took merchantmen that wandered too far from discipline. Midget boats and special missions scored local successes, but the cumulative mechanics of defeat held. Each sunk boat removed a fraction of hard-earned experience from the fleet. Each saved convoy replenished a war economy that, by 1944, had tipped decisively toward the Allies. When new electronics arrived for the U-boats, Allied laboratories were already drafting their obituaries with counter-devices and doctrine. A contest that had once been a race of daring became a race of iteration, and iteration belongs to the side with the broader bench of factories, training schools, and analysts. By the surrender in May 1945, dozens of U-boats surfaced under white flags. A post-war coda, Operation Deadlight, scuttled many of those that remained at sea to deny technology to rivals and to end a hazard in one cold final economy of steel. More than 28,000 submariners, roughly 3 out of 4 who served, did not return. Those who did carried a geometry and memory. How patrol lines once cut across weather maps. How support groups boxed probabilities into certainties. How the larger the grid became, the fewer the exits a pressured hull could find. One reckoning now remained: to add the pieces together and state the lesson the Atlantic had taught by example more than argument. Add it all and the sum is grim. Science that could see at night. Aircraft that could reach the once empty air gap. Escorts that hunted as teams instead of guarding alone. Mortars that punished evasion without warning. Decrypts that emptied ambush lanes before torpedoes could be staged. The U-boats did not simply lose, the Allies solved them, converting an ocean into a mapped problem of bearings, frequencies, and probabilities, and then iterating until the solution was durable. That is why, by war's end, 9 of 10 boats had not returned to a safe peacetime port, and why 3 of 4 men who wore the badge of the U-Boot-Waffe belonged to a generation that paid in silence. Their names now engraved in stone at Kiel and Le Beau, and remembered in the bent frame still sleeping under cold water. The moral is not triumphal. It is caution. In long wars of attrition, innovation accelerates toward convergence. Once that curve bends, bravery cannot outswim math. The U-boat arm began with advantage in doctrine and nerve. It ended in a system that had absorbed its tactics, read its signals, and negated its knights. The legacy lives not just in museums or in the armored vaults of abandoned pens, but in the logic of modern sea control. Networks outrun heroes, and the side that fuses sensing, timing, and production turns oceans into grids. Meanwhile, the Atlantic keeps its own archive in fragments of steel and pockets of rust, in silent rooms where crew lists end midline, and in the occasional fisher's net that hauls up a piece of a war that still lives in metal and memory. History's lesson closes where the story began, inside the pressure hull with shallow breath and the sound of charges stepping closer. The men were not less brave in 1944 than in 1940. The world around them had changed. Each improvement tightened the web. Each web made the next improvement cheaper. And so the arithmetic settled the argument that rhetoric never could. In the end, the ocean learned to hunt its hunters, and an empire of steel vanished beneath a grid. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shaped the world we live in.